Could you actually tell if someone standing right next to you was already rebuilding their entire life in real time? Right now? Most people couldn't. Not because it's being hidden from them. Because the change looks like nothing at all, right up until the day it's everything. No breakdown you could point to. No dramatic exit. No public unraveling loud enough to explain the person who eventually walks out the other side. Just someone who months later, you barely recognize, calmer, harder to rattle, somehow more themselves than they were before. Ask them what happened, and they rarely have a clean answer. Because nothing happened. Not in the way we usually mean it. Here's what should catch your attention. If there was no single event, no visible turning point, then whatever actually changed them was happening the entire time, in full view, right in front of people who knew them, and almost none of those people, including the person it was happening to, knew how to see it. Carl Jung spent much of his career studying exactly this kind of transformation. Not the dramatic kind. The kind with no witnesses. The kind that's usually finished before anyone else notices it started. So here's what we're actually going to do in the next 20 minutes. We're going to teach you to see the pattern almost everyone misses. In other people and in themselves, starting with the exact moment it always begins. Chapter 1: The Myth of Dramatic Rebuilding. We've been sold a very specific image of what change looks like. The montage. The breakdown followed by the breakthrough. The moment someone finally hits bottom and from that single collision with pain rises transformed. It makes for a good story. It's almost never how it actually happens. Ask anyone who has genuinely rebuilt their life, not performed it for an audience, but actually done it, and you'll find the same pattern again and again. It wasn't one moment. It was hundreds of small, unremarkable ones, stacked so quietly that even they can't point to a starting line. A slightly different response to an old trigger, a boundary held for the first time without apologizing for it. A decision made in private that nobody else even knew required courage. Jung's own theory of psychological transformation, what he called individuation, was built on exactly this premise. He didn't describe personal growth as a single dramatic event. He described it as a long, largely invisible process of a person slowly becoming who they actually are. Layer by layer, mostly in solitude. This matters because it changes what you're looking for. If you're waiting for your own rock bottom to arrive before you take yourself seriously, you may be waiting for a permission slip that was never required in the first place. The people who quietly rebuild their lives rarely wait for collapse. They simply, at some point, stop needing an excuse. So if the dramatic version of change is mostly myth, what does the real version actually require? Chapter 2: Where quiet rebuilding actually begins. It begins, almost without exception, with a moment of noticing rather than a moment of deciding. Not "I've decided to change my life." Something smaller and stranger. A person sitting in a familiar situation, the same argument, the same job, the same self-talk they've run 1,000 times, and for one unremarkable second, actually seeing it. Not reacting to it. Seeing it, the way you might notice wallpaper you've walked past for years without ever really looking at. Jung called this the emergence of consciousness out of the unconscious, the moment a pattern that has been running you, silently, for years, becomes visible enough to question. Before that moment, you are the pattern. You don't experience it as a choice, because you can't see it as separate from yourself. After that moment, something has shifted permanently. Even if nothing on the outside has changed yet. You are now something that has a pattern, rather than something that is one. Nothing dramatic happens in that moment. No fireworks. Often the person doesn't even act differently that same day. They just carry a small private awareness they didn't have the day before. And awareness, once it exists, is nearly impossible to put back. That's the part almost nobody talks about when they describe someone's transformation after the fact. They describe the visible chapter, the move, the breakup, the new career. They never describe the months or years of quiet noticing that made that visible chapter almost inevitable by the time it happened. If this is already tracking for you, subscribe, because what happens after that first moment of noticing is exactly what the rest of this video maps out, step by step. Chapter 3. The cost of staying who you were. Noticing a pattern is one thing. Acting on it is another. And the gap between the two is where most people get stuck for years, sometimes permanently, because of a specific psychological trap Jung named directly: the persona. The persona is the mask a person builds to be acceptable to their family, their culture, their own earlier fears. It isn't fake. Exactly, it's a real adaptation that once served a real purpose. The problem is that it was built for circumstances many people have already outgrown. And a mask sized for a life you no longer live starts costing more than it protects. Jung's specific claim here was sharper than the usual fear of change explanation. Maintaining an outgrown persona actively drains you, because it requires constant, low-level performance vigilance about what version of yourself is currently on display. Energy spent keeping the mask from slipping in front of the wrong person. That drain is why so many people describe feeling exhausted by lives that, on paper, aren't objectively hard. The exhaustion isn't about the life. It's about the maintenance cost of the mask. You feel this long before you can name it. A low, persistent tiredness no amount of rest fixes. Irritation at situations that shouldn't provoke that much irritation. A strange grief for a life you're still technically living, the sense of performing a role for an audience that may not even be paying attention anymore. The people around someone in this state often can't see it, because from the outside, everything looks fine. What's invisible is the growing distance between the life being lived and the person actually living it, a gap that widens every time a decision gets made from the old mask instead of the emerging self underneath it. Jung was direct about the trade being made here. He argued the real danger was never the pain of transformation. It was the comfort of staying exactly as you are, indefinitely, because at least you already know how to survive that. So if staying the same has a real cost, and changing has a real risk, what actually tips the balance? Chapter 4. The threshold. Nobody sees you cross somewhere in this process. There is a threshold. Not a single dramatic day, but a point past which going back to the old identity, even if you wanted to, has quietly become impossible. Jung described this as a kind of psychological death and rebirth, not literal, but structural. An old way of being has to be allowed to end before a new one can fully take its place. This is worth sitting with, because it means quiet rebuilding isn't purely additive. It isn't just gaining new habits or new confidence layered on top of who you already were. Something has to be let go of first. And letting go, even of something that was hurting you, tends to feel like loss before it feels like freedom. This is the part of the process that happens in near total isolation, even for people who are surrounded by others. You cannot fully explain a threshold you're still crossing. You don't yet have the language for who you're becoming, because you're not finished becoming it. So this stage is often marked by a strange silence, not withdrawal from people exactly, but a withdrawal from explaining yourself to them. You stop narrating the change out loud, partly because you can't yet, and partly because some part of you already senses it isn't ready to survive other people's opinions about it. Jung's process of individuation requires exactly this kind of solitude. Not permanent isolation, but a season of it, a period where the person turns down the volume on external validation just enough to hear their own signal clearly, possibly for the first time in years. Most people never notice they've crossed this threshold until they're already standing on the other side of it, looking back at a version of themselves they can respect, but can no longer fully relate to. Chapter 5. Why nobody notices at first. Here is the strange part of quiet rebuilding that almost no one prepares you for. The people closest to you are often the last to see it. Not because they don't care. Because the change, in its early stages, is engineered mostly unconsciously to be undetectable. A person quietly rebuilding doesn't announce a new boundary. They just stop over-explaining themselves in one specific situation where they used to over-explain constantly. A person quietly rebuilding doesn't quit their job in a blaze of clarity. They just start, privately, updating a resume they have no immediate plans to use. None of these actions look like anything from the outside. Collectively, they are the entire rebuild. This invisibility isn't accidental, even if it isn't conscious either. Announcing a transformation early invites other people's opinions into a process that is still too fragile to survive them. Tell everyone you're changing before the change has actually stabilized, and you hand them the power to talk you out of it, sometimes with love, sometimes with fear disguised as concern, but the effect is the same either way. Quiet rebuilders, whether they could articulate this reasoning or not, instinctively protect the process by not narrating it. This is also why quiet rebuilding often gets mistaken, in the moment, for withdrawal or moodiness or going through something. People search for a label because the actual explanation that someone is slowly becoming a different person from the inside out doesn't fit into a casual conversation. It's easier for everyone, including the person doing it, to say "I've just been busy" or "I'm fine, just tired," than to try to explain a process that doesn't yet have a finished shape. By the time anyone else notices, the internal work is usually most of the way done. What gets seen from the outside, the calmer tone, the new boundary, the sudden willingness to leave a room rather than argue in it, isn't the beginning of the change. It's the tail end of it, finally breaking the surface. Chapter 6: What this actually looks like. It helps to make this concrete, because described abstractly it can sound almost mystical. In practice, it rarely is. Picture someone who has spent years saying yes to almost everything asked of them. One ordinary Tuesday, nothing special about the date. They say no to something small, a favor, a last-minute request, an invitation they don't actually want to accept. They don't explain why. They don't soften it with 3 qualifying sentences the way they always have before. They just say no, and let the silence that follows sit there, uncomfortable, without rushing to fill it. Nothing dramatic happens. The person who was told no doesn't disown them. The friendship survives. But something in the person who said no shifts permanently in that moment. Even if they can't name it yet, they've just proven something to themselves that no explanation ever could have. That they survived disappointing someone. That the sky does not in fact fall. Or picture someone who has spent a decade defining themselves by a career they quietly stopped believing in years earlier. The quiet rebuild doesn't look like resigning in a single dramatic email. It looks like updating one skill on a weekend, telling no one. It looks like reading one article about a different field, closing the laptop, saying nothing about it at dinner. Small, private, deniable actions that would mean almost nothing individually and mean almost everything collectively, 6 months later. This is the actual mechanism behind every sudden transformation people are later described as having made. There was no sudden version. There was a long private one that finally became visible enough for other people to notice, usually well after the person doing it had already crossed the hardest part. The identity that emerges, what eventually surfaces from this process, isn't a louder version of the old self. It's usually a quieter, more settled one, someone who has stopped performing certainty they don't feel, and stopped explaining choices that don't require justification. Jung believed the goal of individuation was never happiness in the way we casually use the word. It was wholeness, the integration of parts of yourself you'd previously exiled because they were inconvenient, or unacceptable to the people you depended on, or simply too much for the identity you were wearing at the time. The quiet rebuild is, in large part, the slow readmission of those exiled parts back into a single, coherent person. This is why people who've done this work often look, from the outside, less impressive than you'd expect for someone who has fundamentally changed. There's no dramatic new persona to admire. What you notice instead, if you notice anything, is an absence, the absence of the old anxious performance. The absence of constant self-justification, the absence of a person visibly working to be liked. What replaces it isn't flashier. It's just quieter, and much harder to shake. This new identity doesn't need external proof to hold its shape. That's the real marker that the rebuild has taken. The old version needed agreement, needed an audience, needed the people around them to co-sign every decision before it felt real. The new version simply exists, whether or not anyone else is watching closely enough to notice. Chapter 8: What changes around you once this shift is far enough along to be visible? The response from the people around a quiet rebuilder tends to split cleanly into two directions, and which direction a relationship goes reveals more about that relationship than it does about the person changing. Some relationships quietly recalibrate and deepen. Almost always, these are the ones that were never actually built on the earlier, more anxious version of the person. Relationships that can hold a steadier, more boundaried version of them without needing to shrink them back down to the size they used to be. Others grow strained, or end. This is rarely anyone's fault in the dramatic way people want it to be. It's simply what happens when a relationship's real foundation was the old identity's compliance. Its constant availability, its willingness to over-explain and accommodate. Once that foundation is gone, some relationships were never built to survive its absence, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because what was actually being related to, all along, was a role rather than a person. This is usually the most disorienting part of the entire process, more than any internal doubt about whether the change is real. It's watching, almost in real time, which relationships were actually about you and which ones were about the version of you that made everyone else comfortable. And once that sorting happens, something quieter and far more permanent settles in behind it. Maybe the real question isn't whether your life needs a dramatic before and after to count as a real transformation. Maybe it's simpler, and slightly harder to sit with. Is there a version of yourself you've been noticing quietly, in the background, for longer than you've been willing to admit? Jung believed most people go their entire lives without ever meeting that version of themselves, not because it isn't there, but because meeting it requires exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous, undramatic work that doesn't photograph well and doesn't make a good story to tell at dinner. The people who quietly rebuild their lives were never chosen for it. They simply at some point stopped waiting for a crisis to give them permission. You don't need a rock bottom. You only need to keep noticing the small moment. You've probably already had the one where you saw the old pattern clearly, for just a second before going along with it anyway. If this reached you today, tell us in the comments, what's the quiet rebuild you've already started, that you haven't told anyone about yet? And if you're wondering what happens once that rebuild is finished, once the mask is fully gone and there's nothing left to perform for anyone, that's exactly what the next video covers. Until next time, keep building, even where no one can see it.